Disaster has quite literally struck at Elbaf, and things are moving quickly, much faster than I expected. Now, I had to cut out discussion of chapter 1142 short during our live stream, and I did promise to share more of my thoughts, so here we go. Some of my thoughts upon reading and rereading chapter 1142. But before we get into it, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate your help in getting to 100,000 subscribers. So, we start the chapter at the Walrus School, and we are witnessing the God's Knight's plan in action. Shamrock and Gunko already revealed their plans in chapter 1138 to capture and kidnap the children, as well as the fact that they were going to make a game out of it by inviting Killingham and Summers in chapter 1140. Now, I just assumed that this was going to be similar to the rabbit hunting game that we saw during the God Valley flashback, because we did see that the God's Knights were very much involved in that hunting game back then. But now we see that this so-called game at Elbaf is in fact very different, and yet still very twisted in another way. There's something so perverse about manifesting someone's worst fears and then manipulating this nightmarish scenario to lure them into further danger, especially the fact that they are manipulating children in this way. But I do have to say, this is a pretty cool showing of the God's Knight's powers. It seems like Gunko, Killingham, and Summer are actually working together, which again isn't quite what I was expecting, because I thought they were going to engage in a competition on who could capture the most kids. However, I actually like where we're going with this more. I really enjoy this teamwork and the fact that the God's Knights are actually using their powers together. It gives me this sense that the God's Knights have been assembled, that the members, each knight has been very judiciously selected. It's as if the world government has seriously considered whose powers, whose abilities fits harmoniously to make the God's Knights stronger as a unit. Once again proving that the God's Knights is a faction that we cannot ignore. It also makes me question, who did Shamrock want to call to Elbaf initially? If you remember back to chapter 1138, he tasked Gunko with actually only calling one more God's Knight member, because back then he didn't intend to leave. And Gunko asked him, well, which one should I call? So my assumption there in that case is that Shamrock actually called one of the God's Knights that he thought would work well with him. He identified one of the God's Knights members who had abilities that had a nice synergy with his own powers. Someone he thought would make a good team with him and Gunko. In which case, out of these two, Killingham and Summers, I'm inclined to think maybe he chose Killingham, just because it seems like Killingham's the one that's responsible for putting the children to sleep, whereas Gunko's arrow power is what's directing the children. And that may have always been the original plan, to kidnap the children, to use the children in that way. Whereas in that case, that additional layer, the manifestation of the children's fears to attack Elbaf, that must be the handiwork of Summers. And so I'm assuming that once they found out that Shamrock couldn't stay at Elbaf, they chose Summers, knowing that in Shamrock's absence, Summers' ability would be the perfect diversion, the perfect way of bringing chaos to the kingdom to make their kidnapping efforts a little bit easier, or all that much smoother. So I'm inclined to think that the original plan was to enlist Killingham to help assist Gunko in kidnapping the children, and then they were always going to use the children as a bargaining tool to bring Elbaf underworld government control. And in that scenario, Shamrock would have played the role of the negotiator on behalf of the world government, you know, as the captain, as the commander of the God's Knights. And given it seems like he is a very, very capable combatant, I assume he was there to potentially stop and fight any of the Elbafian giants, any of the Elbafian warriors who were going to stand in their way. Whereas now, once Shamrock had to leave, they figured they needed a diversion tactic instead, and that's where Summers has entered the story. And although I am a little disappointed that we don't get to see more of Shamrock immediately in this arc, I do really like this synergy of the abilities of the three that has remained. Like I said, I think this added element of bringing the kids' nightmares to life, doing this whilst the kids are literally forced to unconsciousness, it makes this whole scenario feel a little more eerie, a little more twisted. And I also really like the final panels that we ended this chapter on. We see Summers ask Gunko what her own fears are, and the way that he asks this question, it almost feels as if it's a catchphrase. I suppose that's the reason why the title of this chapter has been named something very similar. This final line of Summers felt very much akin to Kuma's own "if you could take a vacation, where would you go?" Really gave me the chills. So then let's have a look at the manifestation of Summers' powers, shall we? After being introduced to the Jormungandr at the beginning of the chapter, we find out that this beast, this snake, is actually only one of the very many beasts that the God's Knight / Summers has conjured. Each of these beasts, each of these creatures or figures being a manifestation of the fears, of the terrors that the kids themselves imagined and came up with only earlier that day. I think there is something to be said about how Miss Angie asking the kids to imagine and draw the worst fears. Supposedly she just wanted them to express their imagination and their creativity, but I've already discussed the fact that there seems to be a conspiracy going on at Elbaf, and there may be some Elbafians who are or have been working with the world government. Now my main speculation is that that conspirator is King Harold, but maybe Miss Angie is involved. And you should check out that discussion if you haven't already. I'll link that in the description below. But for Miss Angie to have tasked the children with this sort of odd activity on the very same day that the God's Knights are there wreaking havoc, using their powers to manipulate the children's worst fears, I have to say it does feel a little suspicious. It's almost as if Miss Angie planned this, but without further proof, I will leave that for further speculation at another time. But you guys can let me know in the meantime, what do you think? Do you think this is part of a bigger conspiracy? Do you think Miss Angie was involved? Otherwise, I guess we don't actually know how this power works exactly. We also don't even know, it's not confirmed at least, that this is the doing of Summers, although I do think it is very likely that this is Summers' doing, in which case, does Summers need the fears of people to be physically or at least verbally expressed before he can manifest it? Is he somehow able to draw out your worst fears even before you express it yourself? Or do people need to explicitly voice out their fears, draw out their fears? Is that why Miss Angie made these children explicitly draw their fears out so that Summers can manipulate their fears? Or is it the case where Summers actually needs to work hand in hand with Killingham? Can he only conjure out the fears of people when those creations are appearing in your nightmares? Is that why the children were put to sleep? Or is it the case where his powers and even Killingham's abilities work most effectively against children because of their innocence, because of their naivety, because of the fact that they're easier to manipulate, easier to exploit? Children have greater fears. They have less control of their fears. I'm really excited to find out more about how exactly their abilities work, because even in the case of Gunko, we're getting a little bit more information about what the God's Knights are actually capable of. But while we wait for more information to figure out the precise mechanics of their abilities, we have to discuss some of these nightmarish creatures as well. So the Jormungandr is a creature that we have talked about extensively in the past. It's a seriously meaningful creature that signifies the Ragnarok according to Norse mythology, and I have discussed the Jormungandr in previous videos. I've also discussed my thoughts on the red line actually being the Jormungandr, a petrified Jormungandr. And look, I'll link all of those discussions in the description below. But I do think that it is no mistake, it is no coincidence that Oda started the chapter with this beast first. Knowing how important the Jormungandr is to Norse mythology, the fact that the Jormungandr is the heralding, or when the Jormungandr stops biting its tail, that signifies the beginning of the Ragnarok. I think Oda knew exactly what he was doing by incorporating the snake first. But some of the other significant Norse creatures that we see in this chapter include the Fenrir. The Fenrir is one that One Piece fans may already be familiar with, because it seems, or it has been very widely thought that the Norse tale of Fenrir, the wolf beast, as well as Tyr, the hero, the god, is what heavily inspired Oda in coming up with the story of Shanks sacrificing his arm to save Luffy all the way back in chapter 1 of One Piece. And I've also discussed Fenrir and Tyr in another video as well, so I'll link that too. But some other Norse mythological creatures include the Nidhogr, the Nidhogr, the Niohogr, and that's a worm / a dragon that gnaws at the roots of of the magical world tree Yggdrasil. So this Nihogra, the Nidarhogra, is also very much a part of the Ragnarok. And we're also introduced to this idea of the Draugra. I'm so sorry about butchering all of these words, by the way. But the Draugra is an ancient Norse zombie. So these creatures are obviously continuing Oda's dip into the very rich world, the very rich and magical, fantastical world of ancient Norse cosmology, which we already know has greatly inspired Oda in the creation of Elbaf. But I have to say, the creatures that have really caught my attention are, firstly, one of the poor kids' mother, just because I find that so very funny. I find it also very cute, the idea that no matter what sort of fearsome creatures you may face, at the end of the day, you are always most scared of your own mother. There's surely not a coincidence that that kid's mum actually quite looks like Big Mum. But I just think that it's hilarious that even in a scenario like this, a panel like this, where things are so serious, things are so high stakes, Oda just lets his intrusive thoughts win and he sprinkles in a little bit of comedy. But the others that are also mentioned is also very, very meaningful. Kids being scared of a storm, for example. That idea isn't quite new. Even my toddler nephew is quite scared of storms, and that's very understandable. Storms are loud, it's dark, it's rainy, very ominous, but I think it makes more sense when you consider Elbaf. We know that Elbaf's main weaknesses are flames and lightning, two phenomenons that can arise out of a storm, a thunderous storm. We also see that some kids are very much afraid of Loki, and obviously that also makes sense because he has been painted as a villain for at least the past decade. It seems like almost since he was very young. But what really caught my eye about this depiction of Loki is that this Loki seems to be holding two weapons. It seems like he's wielding a hammer behind his back, which is understandable because we have now seen that Loki does in fact wield the Ragnir. But what's really interesting is that this Loki is also holding up a mighty, mighty sword. And this sword is actually the focus because he's holding it up at front, whereas the hammer is hidden behind his back. And my immediate thought is this sword Excalibur? Is this sword the sword that got named only in the chapter prior, the one that's supposedly stuck in Lord Jarul's head? Or is this supposed to be the sword that we've seen stuck, the huge sword at Elbaf? Because it's quite interesting that we did not see that sword in Elbaf in this chapter when we get that long shot of the tree, of the Adam tree that Loki attacks. More on that later. And look, I've also very, very recently discussed the huge significance of both the Ragnir and Excalibur. I highly recommend that video. I'll link that one too. Check it out after this discussion. But of course, out of all these figures, the one that is most interesting, the one that's really, really interesting is the kid's fear of Nika. Everything we've seen so far in Elbaf has given the impression that Nika is a widely celebrated and welcomed figure. The Elbafians truly believe in this sun god. Everyone wants to be him. Everyone wants to worship him. But this insight into the kids, their fears, this highlights that this celebration of Nika may not actually be a sentiment that is held kingdom-wide. And we do know that because different various interpretations of the Harley exists across Elbaf, some people believe Nika as not a liberator but as a destroyer, someone who is violent. But now we actually get the sense that people are genuinely terrified of that fact. People don't just favorably look upon Nika as the strong destroyer, someone that should be looked up to as embodying the warrior's way, but as a destructive god who should be feared. We're now getting a more nuanced look at the Nika lore. And I guess this does make much more sense in consideration of the fact that Elbaf is no longer a kingdom that celebrates violence or celebrates war. So I guess a deity, a figure that always appears during times of war could cause some unease, especially in a time where Elbaf as a kingdom is trying to move away from their violent warring past. And then it makes even more sense for children to be in fear of that Nika figure, because we've seen that the children of Elbaf, this current generation, is the generation that seriously seems to be embodying this new pacifist era of the Elbafian kingdom. Now, this also makes me question King Harold a little bit more. If you've been following my channel, you'll know that, as I mentioned before, King Harold is at the top of my suspicions right now. And so with this chapter, now it makes me wonder whether King Harold's reformation attempt was actually also motivated by him trying to turn the Elbafians away from Nika. As we've established, historically, Nika was the most celebrated god for the Elbafians. He was at the top of the deities. Whereas, simultaneously, we know that Nika has always been feared, has always been hated by the world government. They've stood on opposing sides. So then, if King Harold was indeed working with the world government, it's plausible that he also wanted his kingdom to turn away from Nika, to turn their back on Nika, and to fear Nika instead of welcome him when the prophecy would eventually come about. But again, all of that rests on some of my pre-existing speculations, which again, you can check out. But for now, let's move on. The double spread of the massive beasts that are dwarfing literal giants was absolutely phenomenal. This panel alone makes this a very, very solid chapter for me. I would even say chapter 1142 was maybe an 8.5. And that's saying something because we're coming off the back of some seriously banger chapters in the Elbaf arc. But I have to say that the childlike stylistic nature of these beasts that have come to life from the kids' drawings, it made it feel really, really eerie. I felt very much at unease, especially the evil Nika. It's just so unlike any depiction of Nika that we've seen before. It goes against everything that we have come to associate Nika with. And I guess it really does tie back into that idea of how things can be interpreted differently by different people. One Piece, as we know, is a very nuanced story. Oda loves his nuanced characters. We love nuanced characters. But Saul, Angie, and Principal Keba look tiny, absolutely tiny compared to these creatures. And that's crazy because they themselves are giants. And I'm sure they will have their work cut out for them in coming chapters. But I have to say, they did get a pretty impressive showing of their strength in chapter 1142, and that was a delight to see. Saul got a lovely entry, showing off his haki proficiency with just one damn good punch, knocking out the ferocious snake, knocking out the ferocious Jormungandr, and this is a very pleasant surprise that confirms why Saul was a vice admiral in the past. Saul was indeed very much a powerhouse, which is something that we didn't really get to see in Robin's flashback. Saul has always reminded me of the BFG, the big friendly giant, so it's easy to forget that Saul is actually proper strong. He was a vice admiral for a reason, and this chapter was a very, very apt reminder of that. And you could see that the kids very much felt the same way, not only about Saul, but also about Principal Keba, whom up until this point, I don't think they knew that he was once a part of the giant warrior pirates. So I'm gonna hazard a guess and say that Principal Keba might be a Watun, a giant cross fisherman, or more specifically, a giant cross walrus fisherman. And supposedly this walrus school seems to have been named after Principal Keba the walrus. Similar to Saul, Principal Keba doesn't immediately strike you as a combatant. His introduction in this chapter is as a sweet old grandpa with these sweet old glasses. Only for moments later, we see him totally kick ass, using his walrus-themed club or his walrus-themed hammer, also beating Jormungandr. And I think what I liked most about this segment was the kids' reactions. Like I said earlier, it's really the kids of Elbaf who are truly buying into the kingdom's new peaceful ways. And this seems to be the first time that the kids got to confirm the strength of the hearsay legends of yore, of Elbafian's heroes of yesteryear. And so, after this attack, I wonder whether this incident is going to reignite that fire and awaken the warrior blood within all the Elbafian children. And I guess across Elbaf more generally, this is when they're going to wake up and going to realize maybe our warrior ways isn't something that we should be moving away from so blindly. In which case would actually actually be highly ironic in a way, especially because if King Harold really was in cahoots with the world government, it's the world government's most recent actions that may have just destroyed a plan that was a century in the making. Anyways, like I said, things are moving a lot quicker than I expected, and I imagine the likes of Robin and Chopper, whom we did get to see in this chapter, are going to, as well as with the rest of the Straw Hats who are still at the feast, they're going to have to quickly switch gears to help try and save the children whilst also fending off the ferocious beasts, and I'm excited to see that. I'm excited to see them get into strategy mode. But in the meantime, let's see what's happening with some of the other Straw Hats on the other side of Elbaf, or should I say in the other world of Elbaf, in the underworld, because this chaos that's happening at Elbaf is twofold. So picking up where chapter 1141 ended, we also get to see what's happening in the underworld now that Loki is almost free. Standing tall, absolutely towering over everyone, including the captain of the new giant warrior pirates. I know Zora already mentioned in the last chapter that Loki is Orz's size, but seeing him tower over another fellow giant is truly a sight to behold. This panel also features the monster trio standing up to Loki, and that got me very, very hyped for what is surely to come, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that felt that way. So Loki has taken the first step and has proven that he actually truly is a menace. This mystical hammer of his, Ragnir, it's not just decoration. We see more of the hammer that was teased back in chapter 1141, and it does really resemble Mjolnir, the mythical hammer of Thor according to Norse mythology, and I would have loved to see more focus on Loki using this mighty weapon. Look, these panels in chapter 1142, these panels of Loki went hard, they were cold. But I personally think I personally think that Loki deserved at least a full page or even his own double spread. But upon rereading this chapter, I do think that I'm sure we will be getting a much more extensive look at Loki, at his abilities, at his strength in the future. So I completely understand why we didn't get that in this chapter. And so I guess I'm just very excited for when we get to see more of Loki in action. But I have to say, his actions versus his dialogue in this chapter is super, super interesting. Because despite swinging his hammer, and not just at anyone, but actually at the Adam tree itself, the tree that gives birth to all of Elbaf, he causes a lightning strike, aka triggering both of Elbaf's greatest weaknesses. And yet, Loki also insists that he should be freed in order to save Elbaf. And you know what? Call me crazy, but I believe him. I do think that Loki's little attack here, this actually was just a small demonstration and then a relatively empty threat from Loki. Seeing just how capable he is of destroying Elbaf if he really wanted to, if he truly put his mind to it, I do think it's now clear that that is not his actual goal. Yes, he did just cause some lightning and some fire, and I'm sure this will be not insignificant damage, but I do think that Loki here is actually making more of a point. A Buster Call level of attack would be usually needed to destroy an island, and yet here we have Loki just showing us how much damage he can inflict just by himself. So I think that if he really wanted to destroy Elbaf, he could have done so all those years ago, before he was captured, before he turned to piracy. If he really wanted to destroy Elbaf, there was nothing stopping him. So this really all feeds back into what I already believe, what I already thought of Loki. A brash, violent, loud-mouthed, but also kind at heart. A prince of Elbaf that actually has his kingdom's best interests at heart. And that is what I fully expect him to be revealed or redeemed as by the end of this arc. And who knows, maybe this double trouble scenario is exactly the perfect way to showcase this. Loki may be the one that's going to fight off all the beasts that the God's Knights have conjured, that they've unleashed at Elbaf, and maybe he'll do this sort of like a tsundere, supposedly under the guise of, I'm only helping Elbaf because I want to get revenge on the God's Knights who killed my own friends, where in reality he actually truly cares for his kingdom as well. And I suspect this is what Oda is building us up to, but I'd really be interested in knowing whether you guys have been convinced of Loki's true, not so evil at heart nature. So let me know by leaving a comment below. But anyways, I don't expect to see this happen until we at least get the monster trio go head to head against this behemoth of a prince. Even if it's just a little clash between the monster trio and Loki, I mean, why else would Oda have set up the Straw Hats? Why would he have separated the Straw Hats like this? By the way, just as a side note before we move on, I have to say, I love how Oda is just consistent with Haruden's head lump in this chapter. The fact that he's still drawing it in this chapter, I think it's really funny. Also more funny because he's remembered to draw Haruden with the head bump, and yet that massive sword at the Atom Tree is gone, is missing in this chapter. Why? Is it just a mistake, or is there something going on? Has someone already stolen the sword? Also, another thing that I wanted to mention about chapter 1142. After all the major things that he could have chosen to end the chapter on, after all of these things that we've just witnessed, I have to say I find it very curious that Oda chose the final panels to be a relatively simple, but I suspect a very meaningful exchange between Summers and Gunko. I mean, yeah, I guess on the first level, it shows us that the God's Knights are in fact behind what's happening with the kids of Elbaf. But I also think that Gunko's response to Summers about what her fears are, what she's most scared of, the fact that she responds she's most scared of Nika, I think there are so many layers to this response. I think it signifies so many things. So firstly, on one level, it really hypes me up as to how Luffy's going to respond to everything that's happening in Elbaf. I think he's going to demonstrate why Nika is a figure to be feared indeed. He's going to whip out his gear fifth. He's going to be an absolute terror, and I'm super excited to see it. But also, I think this line could be serving as a foreshadowing for some flashback when we delve further into the Nika legend, into the Nika lore. Maybe we'll find out for ourselves why Nika isn't solely a figure to be celebrated. Why genuinely he should be a figure that can be feared, that should be feared. Maybe that he is really truly a more nuanced deity who doesn't solely represent good. And in that way, it sort of acts as a callback to the fears of the Elbafian children that we saw earlier in the chapter. But I also think that on another level, on a more personal, intimate level for Gunko, I think Gunko's response offers us a glimpse into Gunko's backstory, into her personal history. Gunko is a very interesting character that I think we're going to need to discuss at much greater depth. I think there is a lot going on here. The fact that she's a God's Knight, but obviously not one of the traditional Celestial Dragon families. And I do plan to delve much deeper in this, so stay tuned. Make sure to subscribe to the channel if you're not already. Because in fact, the God's Knights as a unit is something that I really do want to get into further. Even Summers' final line about how to love is to hurt one another. I'm really curious as to what he really meant by this and how this sort of fits into the situation, or whether it's a greater glimpse about Summers as a character or about the God's Knights as a faction, as a group, their relationship. So I'd love to discuss the God's Knight in greater detail, and I do plan to do so, especially because we now have a lot of time on our hands because we are unfortunately facing a break week. But rest assured, don't fear, don't worry, because I am here to fill your break week void. So please make sure to subscribe if you're not already. Also, if you enjoyed today's discussion, make sure to like and share the video. You can also become a Patreon or channel member like these wonderful people. But as always, thank you so much for listening to another one of my ramblings. This is JoyGirl, and I'll see you again soon.